And I want to welcome all of you again to this part 2 of the webinar, Bringing a Racial Equity Lens into Our Work with Communities. And I hope that you're all in good health. It looks like you are. And so I'm very, very happy about that. And I also want you to know that we have you in our minds and in our prayers and best wishes for you to stay healthy and safe. So it's great to have you all here. Thank you for joining us today. I want to start by, again, introducing my esteemed colleague who will be co-facilitating this webinar with me. And you've met her before. You already know her well, Gwen Whiting. And Gwen is our Director of Training and Leadership Development at Every Democracy. So welcome, Gwen.
Thank you, Val. And I'm happy to be working with you again, Val.
Likewise.
So, most of you probably know Val Ramos. Yeah. And Val is esteemed, since he likes using that word, I'll use it. He's the Director of Strategic Allies and Equity Officer as well. And he's a great dancer. He's a great singer.
Oh, thank you.
Guitar player. What's the specialty, Val? What's the specialty?
It's, flamenco.
Flamenco. Yes.
Yeah.
If you ever get to hear him perform, he's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gwen. Thank you so much. Sandy, you're going to share with us some information about housekeeping for Zoom?
So where are you, Sandy?
I'm so sorry. Technical difficulties here. So, all right. Yes, technical difficulties. I've got little buttons that are sticking and everything. So sorry for the shakeups in the slides. But yes, housekeeping information. Our meeting is being recorded. And when you're not speaking, be sure to mute yourself to reduce background noise. I think everybody's an expert at this point. Your audio and video controls are on the lower left of your screen. You can minimize the video boxes at any time. And for those of you who are not sure, you can also use speaker view or gallery view, whichever you're comfortable with. And then hold your questions till the end or write them in the chat box. Okay?
Excellent. Thank you, Sandy. As you know, we had part 1 in March. And we had to devote, a significant amount of time during that webinar to doing some check-in with everyone. So that did take some time, which was great. I think it was important that we had some check-in about COVID-19 and how we're managing the crisis in our different communities. But we do have a significant amount of material to go over today. So we're going to keep the introductions very, very short. And if you could please state your name and the organization you're with very quickly in about 15 seconds, that would be great. And anyone can start.
I'll start. My name is Andrea Jacobs, and I'm with Interfaith Works in Syracuse, New York, and I specifically work in the Center for Dialogue. So I enjoy learning from all of you.
Great, welcome.
Okay, this is Melissa Eccles, and I'm with Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, particularly working with our dialogue program as well.
That's great to have you here, Melissa.
I'm Peggy Schlechter. I work for South Dakota State University Extension Service. I'm a community development field specialist and super excited to be on this because I heard the first one was really, really good. So I was looking forward to this one.
It's great to have you, and thanks for joining us today, Peggy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Stout. I am a faculty member in the Human Development and Family Science Department at Oklahoma State University on their Tulsa campus. I'm also a co-director of the Center for Public Life at OSU Tulsa that does dialogue to change work in the Tulsa metro area, as well as communities, Stillwater and other communities across the state.
Great to have you here, Mike. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Patrick Grayshaw. I'm a graduate student that works with Mike Stout and Melissa. I'm at OSU Tulsa and getting my PhD in Human Development and Family Science.
Awesome. Great, Patrick. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lakeisha Hayes, Executive Director with Project Ujima in Akron, Ohio. We work with our Full-Term First Birthday, which is our initiative to address infant mortality. And so we co-facilitate the centering circles for pregnant and parenting moms. And then we also do race dialogues using the framework Facing Racism in Everyday.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Lakesh.
That leaves me. I'm Bruce Mallory from New Hampshire Listens, based at the University of New Hampshire. Nice to see some familiar faces again. We're all Zoom friends at this point, at least. But New Hampshire Listens is a statewide resource that supports communities to increase civic life and participation with a focus on equity.
Great to have you here, Bruce. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Val.
Anyone else?
I think that's it.
I think that's it. Right?
Well, yep.
So Gwen will be sharing with us now the learning goals for this webinar. Gwen?
Okay, thanks, Val. So we have goals, and as you know, this is part 2 to the part 1 that's most of you participated in last time. So some of the goals probably continuing, but we want to learn from each other about race and racism and how it impacts our communities that you're working in. Learn about racial equity and what a racial equity lens looks like in our work. You know, everyday democracy, we talk about doing community engagement through a racial equity lens, and as well as the other equities as well. And we want to share challenges and best practices on embedding racial equity principles and practices in your work in your community. And we want to share concrete tools and activities to help incorporate a racial equity lens into the work that you're doing. So those are our goals for today.
Thank you, Gwen. And so we started, as you know, with part 1, addressing this issue. And one of the topics that we began to talk about was race. So in the next few slides, I'm going to do a review of what we discussed and shared with you in part 1. And we started with the concept of race, of course, which, as you know, is a social construct rooted in white privilege and power. It is used by people in power to place other people in a hierarchy and justify different treatment. Race as a social construct has no biological or scientific rationale or basis. And you'll remember, those of you who participated, we watched a short video that talked about that. And then it's also a fluid construct, which means that it's defined historically through racialization and the creation of racial categories to sort of determine or decide who can be part of whiteness, who can be considered part of those who benefit from white privilege. We also talked about racism, and we learned that it operates at the individual, institutional, and systemic level. So at the systemic level, we're talking about structural racism. And we examine, each of those levels, the individual with implicit bias, microaggressions, and other forms of discrimination and bigotry, institutional in terms of policies and practices, and systemic, incorporating the larger context of culture and other aspects, as well as institutional. We also learned that racism has had a long and complex history. It's manifested itself through slavery, the oppression of Native Indigenous people, and colonialism in much of the hemisphere, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we learned that because of that, racism has impacted people coming from different parts of this hemisphere into the United States. And of course, some of them by force, as was the case with enslaved people, and others being deprived of their land, and others being exploited and oppressed in countries like Latin America, for example. So this impact is part of the racist structure, and that's one thing we did cover the last time. So now we're going to get to the new part of this webinar, which is understanding how racism, systemic and institutional, has excluded some from opportunities and given others what is known as unearned advantages. So the next slide is going to highlight some of those disparities. And we start with the first one. Obviously, wealth is an indicator of how racism has advantaged some people and not others. This one, it really, really highlights how the wealth gap that has existed, and again, the importance of talking about cumulative wealth that has benefited whites through unearned opportunities and advantages over centuries. And this slide obviously shows that. Let's go back, Sandy, to the previous one. Previous slide, yeah. No, that one, yeah. Just want to get any of you to sort of share any impressions that you have with this slide, anything that comes to your mind. Any comments?
I'm not surprised at all.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this is all generationally, right? And when we're considering that, you know, African Americans were enslaved, were brought in and deprived of their, you know, of their dignity and life in many cases, and opportunities historically over a period of centuries. It's no surprise that we have that cumulative wealth gap that this slide highlights. Next slide.
So just a comment on that. It's sort of a question and comment.
Sure.
I assume that what that means is that the wealth gap between Black and white families has been closing, but it's been closing at such a glacial pace that it'll take 228 years to close that. So that assumes that even that amount of so-called progress, it's not the right word, would continue at that pace.
Mm-hmm.
If 5 years from now, when we look back at the effects of COVID-19 on African American families, that timeline is going to get stretched out.
That's right.
Unless there's incredible direct intervention to try to mitigate that, right?
Absolutely, Bruce.
So I think that's, I mean, there are two things here. One, this is a really powerful data point by itself. But the other is that we can only, I mean, it's insane, but we can only achieve this, close the gap in 228 years,
right.
Barring, you know, some complete retreat, even from the ridiculous pace we've been making so far. So anyway.
Very, very important point, Bruce, because obviously it assumes that we are going to be working to change that.
Right, exactly.
That's all it does. It doesn't say that that's what's going to happen in 228 years. It says that if we work towards removing those barriers, as you said, that then we'll find, you know, to bridge that gap as well. And of course, we have situations that happen. You mentioned, Bruce, COVID-19, the impact that's going to have on communities of color, which is probably not even considered in this slide. The same thing also with the Great Recession of 2008 to 12, where communities of color were most impacted by the housing crisis and the economic crisis that we had, the Great Recession. So thanks for bringing that up, Bruce.
It really makes you think, you know, throw up your hands and say, in whose lifetime would that actually happen? You know, and where's the hope there? What's that, Mike?
I said our great-grandchildren's lifetime.
Yeah,
Great-grandchildren.
great.
I just wanted to give a little shout out to a book that really captures why this matters that I've been using in my class. That looks backwards. It's called Toxic Inequality. And this is all about how America's wealth gap destroys mobility, deepens the racial divide, and threatens our future. So if you're interested more in why that number matters, why it matters that the average white family, you know, has so much more wealth than the average non-white family, this book helps put that in context for you.
Hey, Mike, can you type that in the chat? We save the chats, and so put that reference there.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. That's great. That's great reading. Absolutely. Any other comments?
I think it's interesting when we bring that up with high school kids, when we do dialogues with high school kids, that their reaction is always like, well, who cares? I mean, this is up to me to like get a job and make money. And like, they sort of just don't want to pay attention to it. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, here we are now. And so it's up to me. And so I'd be curious. I mean, obviously, like I know videos and articles and all of that, but I'm curious about that book because I think the showing how the impact is compounded over years. But it's a communal impact. It's not just an individual impact, because obviously not every Black person is poorer than every white person, right? But it's very hard to get the transition from the individual to the communal, I think, as you're developing and learning about it.
And let's keep that comment in mind, because when we talk about, what does the racial equity lens entail? It's really looking at those issues that, sort of separating the personal from the systemic and institutional. That's very important. Next slide. So the next slide is, I mean, this has to do with population. Obviously, people will make up a majority of the US population by 2043. So the US will be a majority minority population by that time. Some people say even before that. Yet you can see the difference in the wealth, in terms of the wealth divide. Next slide. And here we look at, for every dollar earned by whites, Hispanics, Latinos earn 70 cents. And by the way, that reminds me also of women, because I believe it's close to that, 70, 75 cents. Women earn 75 cents for every dollar that men earn. And imagine if you are an African-American or Latino woman, Latina, then that gap is even larger. And for Blacks, obviously 59 cents for every dollar. And that hasn't changed a whole lot, despite these efforts to try to increase the minimum wage. There's still a large gap. And I believe this is 2014. So we're not talking about 10 years ago. We're talking about just 6 years or so ago. Any comments on this?
So this is Peggy, and just a comment. So if I'm looking at this right, when it talks about, for example, Hispanics earn 70 cents for every dollar earned by whites. Hispanic women, actually, it's less.
It's less,
right?
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So 70 cents is like the best end, really.
That's right. That's right. I mean,
all right.
The reality is Latina women could be making 50 cents for all we know. And it wouldn't be so unrealistic to think about that. And the same thing with Black women. Probably, they would be making probably 30 cents, 35 cents in some cases. Good point. Next slide. This is a really nice, powerful slide because it shows the way that the racial disparities in school discipline, and some of you have done great work on this, and know that especially Black young girls are more targeted. There's studies out there that show that they are targeted for disciplinary action more so than almost any other students, Black girls in particular. And the same thing with boys, but you can see here the comparison. For every white student, 3 of them are at higher risk of being expelled. And for every white student, 4 Black students are have higher risk of facing multiple suspensions. And so what do you think what's one impact that disadvantage can lead to? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I know that it's been connected a lot to the school to prison pipeline.
Yes.
And so one is higher interactions with the criminal justice system, particularly for young Black males, in terms of juvenile justice, those kinds of things.
Very good point, Mike. Thank you. Very good point.
We're also aware in the last couple of years, we have new data that this pattern starts to show up in preschool, kindergarten, and the very early primary grades in school.
Exactly.
That's something that we really weren't, I don't think, paying attention to until more recently. So the pattern, the disproportion shows up early on because judgments are made about kids of color's behavior.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And of course, the message that gets sent to them right away is, we don't want you here. And
That's
so I
right.
think the psychological impact starting at age 5, 6, 4,
Right.
that you're not a part of us because you don't act like the rest of us, is that has huge life, including, you know, the prison pipeline, but also mental health issues, sense of confidence, sense of agency, sense of worth.
Absolutely.
So that I think, you know, there's so much behind these statistics.
Right, and it's all interconnected. And thank you, Bruce, for pointing that out. And this is an area where implicit bias plays into. Implicit bias, and there's some studies, you know, by the Curran Institute, for example, that shows that white teachers tend to target African American and Latino children more so than they do whites. Not all white teachers, but you know, a significant number of them do. And so implicit bias plays out here as well, very much. And what you mentioned, Bruce, definitely about starting earlier. This leads to what is called child adverse experiences. You know, you've probably heard of that term, that they carry with them most of their lifetime, if not their whole lives, right? Next slide. And we are in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic and economic crisis. We have to remember, I'm sure you know, that this is both a health but also an economic crisis because it impacts people of color dramatically. And the studies are starting to come out. For those of us, for all of us who've been doing this work, addressing racial equity disparities, you know, over many years, this is no surprise to us, you know. But, you know, one of the things that this crisis has done is highlight something that already was there from before the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can see here, Chicago in particular, and I can't read it very well, but you can see that definitely there, the number of lives lost to COVID in Chicago, and then also the population groups that live there. And you can see that African Americans in particular are disproportionately affected by COVID, more so in terms of not only infections, but also death outcomes. And I suspect for Latinos, it's very similar also. Any comments on that slide from anyone?
I think that one interesting thing about kind of some of this data is that there's many reasons why I could speculate. I mean, I think we're not shocked by this, and there's so many different reasons why we might think that this is the case. And I think it's really important, especially as we're having these conversations, to be able to present all that data and all that different information, because there's so many different pathways that I could think of why this is the case, for example. And you might be hearing one side. You might hear about underinsured. You might just hear about education and so forth. And I think it's really complex. And so we need to make sure that we're showing all those different paths.
Right. And that's exactly what the racial equity lens is, by the way. I'm glad you mentioned that because, you know, it's important to understand that there's underlying health conditions, pre-existing conditions for many of these communities of color that make them more vulnerable. It's not that they are running out there, you know, without masks and getting themselves infected. Is that even if they take precautions, if they do get infected, their outcome is going to be more likely, more severe than for others because of the historical accumulation of disadvantages and health disparities. And one example is what the work that the Project Eugenia is doing about infant mortality disparities. There's a lot of the context that those communities there are facing and the children and the mothers that make them vulnerable to all kinds of illnesses.
Yeah, and one thing that I would add, the COVID-19 crisis to me has really done it's shined a light on our pre-existing structural and systemic inequities that we have in society. And it's really showing why those things matter.
Yeah.
And how something as, unanticipated, as unlikely as a novel virus going through the population can exploit those pre-existing inequities to disproportionately affect outcomes for groups that were already being
Yes,
proportionally affected by things that were going on in society.
that's right.
And I hope it leads to a conversation, a society-wide conversation about why that matters. For those of us who have been working on these issues for a long time, it always, the argument comes back, it's about personal responsibility and all of these things. But I don't think that argument applies in the face of a global pandemic. And so I'm actually hoping that this data can help to tap people out of it and have these conversations in a more meaningful way, so that it won't take 284 years for us to start decreasing that wealth gap that more significantly and those kinds of things.
Absolutely. That's a very good point, Mike.
Lakeisha typed a quote that I have heard. When white folks get a cold, black folks get pneumonia.
Yes, that's right. That's a very powerful quote. Great quote. Thanks for sharing that, Lakeisha. Thank you.
Val, I'll add something to this.
Sure.
We know that the CDC and many state public health offices have not been releasing demographic data around impacts of COVID-19. That's starting to change now. And so this morning, for the first time, public health offices in New Hampshire released the racial identities of the cases in the state. And New Hampshire, which is one of the wealthiest states in the country, low poverty rates, low childhood poverty rates, et cetera, the exact same patterns hold true in New Hampshire. So, for example, Hispanic and Latino populations are about not quite twice as likely to have a diagnosed case of COVID-19 than whites. The Black and African American, I'm using their language here, are 5 times as likely to be identified with COVID-19 as the white population. So I think back to Mike's point, it's so easy in a place that's a predominantly white state, where about 8% of our total population is folks of color, for people to just overlook the reality of the lives of a relatively small proportion of folks in the state. This data is objective, it's inarguable, and it's exactly the same pattern we're seeing in Chicago and Detroit and other places. So it's horrible, it's discouraging to see that, but it is finally another tool that we all have to focus on policy, to focus on advocacy.
Exactly. Good point, Bruce. Thank you. Thanks for sharing the statistics. Yeah, thank you. And this next slide is really about Louisiana. I'm sure you've seen the news reports. And in fact, the mayor of one of the cities there, I forgot which one it was talking precisely about this. I think New Orleans, maybe it was the mayor of New Orleans. And you can see here the disparities as well. And we know that that's, there's impact happening throughout that whole region, of course, in different cities. They're all impacted by COVID, but people of color are the ones that are having the most difficulty and the ones that are most impacted by this. Any comments on this?
We're talking about the United States, but there was a clip that came across my phone yesterday of a picture of folks in, I think it was in India, but it, it's talking about the, quarantining and keeping in your space, but apartment buildings, and it looks like at least 10 people in each apartment, and they're all out on their respective balconies. It's just not even a reality. Some of the things that they're saying, to be safe.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Gwen, because as you know, many communities of color, and including immigrant undocumented communities, sometimes they have 5, 6, 7 people living in the same apartment, and living in cities that have high density, like New York City, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia, Chicago. Those large cities is where a lot of these concentrations of people of color live in communities that are very high density. And so for them, it's not, they can't afford to be moving, they can't move to a place that has less density because they live right in the middle of it. And so the reality of residential segregation, for example, has contributed to this experience of being more vulnerable to getting infected by COVID-19. So that's all related to housing discrimination and redlining and residential segregation also contributes to that. Next slide.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I think what comes out of this too that I think about is the trauma that we continual experience. And I think that, again, as a world, we're all experiencing trauma with this.
Yes.
And then if you know somebody who has died and has had to grieve in a time of social distancing, that is a specific type of trauma that so many people are experiencing because we can't come together as a society with families and with friends to remember people. And then specifically, if they're this community with this graph is showing that is experiencing a higher number of deaths. And what that does, I mean, if anybody on this call, we've known, a few people who have died, and it's hard to sit in your homes and try to grieve that, and it feels traumatic. And so for so many people of a specific demographic to be experiencing trauma on trauma on trauma, based on what they're coming into this experience with, and then how they're moving through it, and then it impacting a larger number, that moves forward with them, right? It moves forward with us all, but it will be a bigger impact.
Absolutely.
With families that are experiencing this and knowing more people who are impacted.
Very good point. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you. Next slide. So we have really looked at, and we could spend the whole afternoon putting slides there that highlight the disparities that historically have existed, impacting people of color adversely because of racism, structural systemic racism. So when we're looking at this, how do we address these disparities, right? And so you see people, oh, you have to treat everyone equally. Because people of color are not being treated equally. That's what they say. But is it really about equality, or is it about equity, right? Because we've been talking about how people of color already have historical cumulative disadvantages. So they're not here in the same place as whites are. When we look at this diagram, it really highlights this dichotomy of those two concepts. So I'm wondering what some of you, when you look at these three images in this slide, what does it tell you? And I'm sure you've seen this before many times, but just want to get us to look at it, and given what we've talked about, and given the fact of historically accumulated disadvantages, what does this image say to us?
I've seen this obviously before, but I just noticed something different that I've never noticed before, which, equality, equity, and then I've seen like the word liberation or whatever under the third one. But with equity, with the one box and then the two boxes, everybody is still seeing from the same point of view. Where the third image, the taller person could say to the smaller person, well, what's your view? Like, tell me what you're seeing, and I'll tell you what I'm seeing, and you're respecting the person more than trying to get everybody to see the same way.
Exactly.
And I've never really picked that up from there.
Yeah, that's a very good observation. Great. Any other thoughts? That's great.
One of the things that I noticed when I looked at it, in the first box where all of them are standing, they're all lifted up equally. The little one that's the shortest, his arms are still down. Like, okay, this is still not, it's still not working for me, kind of thing. I mean, that's what I noticed as a poor, and it's interesting because in the one that's far over to the right, where nobody is lifted up, his arms are up for some reason, and I don't know why his arms are up there. Because to me, I would have had him down there too, but but it's kind of like, here I am in that one, And then on the far left, when it's like, okay, we're going to raise everybody up equally, his arms are down, kind of like, well, this really didn't help me, or, I'm still not feeling it. So.
That's such a great point. That's a wonderful point. And you can see here the images. The first two images, there's things, of course, that are different from the third one. Two things. One, the fence, right? And then those boxes, or, boxes, I guess, where they stand. Obviously, the fence is the barriers. And the boxes are what society is trying to do to help them have access to the game. And that's where the equality, the first one is about equality. The second one, you see that those people of color, because they're shorter, which means because they've had more pre-existing oppression and conditions of inequity, that then they require a lot more. And so any other thoughts on that before we move to the next slide?
One thing that I've noticed about it that I hadn't thought of, because I've kind of seen these three slides, it's like equality, equity, and justice is the way that third one. And it seems to me like one is a way of helping people to get around barriers, like putting boxes that for people to stand on. But the other is that structural change so that those barriers don't exist anymore.
Exactly.
And to me, that's what that fence that you can see through is saying is, with structural change, we can eliminate inequalities in our systems and institutions in a way that's more focused towards social justice.
Exactly. Yeah.
The other thing with that I don't know why I didn't think about this one before either is this time I was looking at the boxes more as resources. And in the third one, if we make structural changes, we might not even need extra resources to make things equitable. And so we can actually shape the system in a much more efficient way.
Right. Yeah.
So to push the metaphor a little further, of course, the true liberatory image would be there'd be no fence at all, right?
Exactly. That's correct.
Those three folks would be sitting in the stands.
That's right. That's right.
That's an obvious one that we've all thought about. The other one, though, that occurs to me that I haven't really drilled in on before was the system that creates these structural inequities is usually invisible to everyday folks, right? So in this image, the system that keeps people out is physical, it's concrete, it's clear, we can see the fence, whatever the fence is made of. But when we start talking about systemic and structural racism, for most folks who haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about that, it's not visible. And so part of our challenge, I think, is to try to make that amorphous, diffuse, kind of implicit system that is responsible for that 288 years, 38 years, visible and obvious and concrete to the folks that we work with. Right. So anyway, thanks for provoking my thinking about.
Yeah, and that's
it's easy to talk about. It's not easy, but it's It's all of us go to wanting to bring people's attention to structural and systemic racism. But for a lot of folks, it's a pretty complex process, and we need to find ways to make that as real as we can.
Right, exactly. And also another thing is you see the obviously the little kid at the end just obviously celebrating. The image that portrays for me is these checks that were sent, this economic whatever they call it, to the $1,200 checks for those who made less than $75,000. They sent the same amount of money to everyone, right? $1,200 they sent it to somebody who makes $74,000, and for somebody who makes $30,000, they still got the same amount. And again, that even shows the way of thinking around the whole idea of equality versus equity. And so that when they started talking about those checks, I said to myself, well, that's another example right there. Next slide.
Also, I just want to point out, I've used this slide and there are other versions of it. And this one, where all the people look white.
Oh yeah, right.
The image there, but on another whole layer of conversation in terms of talking about equality and equity and what that means to have people who look white as opposed to people who look black and brown as well.
Exactly.
And with that,
Yeah.
I really enjoyed this conversation that you all had, but that's another layer there to think.
Very important point. You're right, Gwen. You're definitely right. So this summarizes already what we've talked about. The first one, obviously, it shows that it assumes that everyone will benefit from the same supports, so that's equality. And the second image, they're given different supports to make it possible for them to have access to the game, and they're being treated equitably. But in the next image, all these they all can participate because we removed all of the structural barriers, as Bruce was saying, as everyone has been discussing. Next slide. So now that we understand this whole concept of equal versus equitable, then we can start thinking about addressing disparities, not only in terms of equal resources, but also in terms of equitable resources and systemic barriers, addressing them so that equitable outcomes can happen for people of color. Next slide. Gwen?
Yeah, so given the conversation that we had and the slides that we just saw, just want to have a little chat, and we've got, this is in at 1:30 now?
Yeah, we might run a little bit more.
We have,
because we started a little later. So if it's okay with everyone, maybe we can run until 1:40. Is that okay?
So what does racial equity mean for you? You and the work that you're doing, we all have definitions about what that looks like. So what is it like for you? And as you apply to the community engagement work that you do?
To me, it involves understanding that the issues that affect communities don't affect all parts of the communities in the same way. And therefore, our responses to those issues can't treat it like a one-size-fits-all approach to those to those issues, right? Yes. So we need to be able to, and from a dialogue and deliberation standpoint, we need to make sure that we have those voices represented in the problem-solving process, so that that input and that community wisdom about how it differentially affects people can be taken into account with our responses.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent point. Thank you, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts?
I think when, I forget who a minute ago said that, kind of this racial equity is often harder to see. And I think of the unintended consequences of all the ideas that are generated through dialogue, and making sure that people run through what are the unintended consequences that might have racial equity issues. And so there might be some really good ideas, but we have to walk it all the way through to make sure that it does have racial equity, because it might not appear that it's inequitable at the start, but that's because it's really challenging to sometimes see some of these racial inequities.
Mm-hmm.
Great point. Thank you. Mm-hmm. All right. So in light of the time that we have left, let's move to the next slide. And before that, Sandy, the definition. Yeah. This definition I found that is from Racial Equity Tools. And in fact, it's probably a combination of 2 or more different kinds of definitions. But I thought of it as this. I think this is very useful because it offers, it can help us create an anti-racist framework for our work with communities. And let me read it. It says, racial equity exists when race and or ethnicity are not predictors of success in any aspect of life, and when public policies, institutional practices, and social structures no longer favor whites over people of color. I want to get very quickly your impressions. Any of you have any thoughts on that definition? If you like it, or if you think it falls short in some way?
I think that it's kind of implicit in this definition, but it maybe would be helpful to have a more explicit part of the definition that focuses on how resources in society are distributed.
Yes.
Because I think that's I mean, when you're talking about like racial formation and racial hierarchies, I mean, all of those things are in place to justify the unequal or inequitable distribution of resources.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's implied here, but I would like to see it a little more
fleshed out. Yes. And that's a good point, Mike, because that's where we're going with the racial equity lens. That is the racial equity lens is what's going to help us flesh this out even more. Yes, very good point. Okay, next slide. So, Gwen?
So Val mentioned the racial equity lens, and I said early on, you know, when we do our work, we talk about doing community engagement work through a racial equity lens explicitly, along with all of the other equity lenses that we may need to use, but we pulled that one out explicitly. So we have some examples of what that might look like. Next slide, Sandy. And just want to see how it resonates. And do you, in fact, use that terminology that as I do my work, I'm going to use the lens of racial equity to make sure that we're paying attention to that. So the first one, naming race and institutional racism explicitly when talking about problems and solutions. Looking at problems and their root causes from a structural standpoint, not simply from a personal individual standpoint. I want you to think about these and which ones resonate with you. Understanding disparities, learning why they exist and addressing them. And then I think we have a couple more. If we go to the next one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, understanding how white privilege operates in different sets of circumstances. Not perpetuating, but rather removing barriers such as policies, practices, attitudes, behaviors to opportunity and equity. Gathering and analyzing data and information about race and ethnicity, data disaggregation as only part of the analysis. Is there another one, Sandy?
I think that's it.
So, as we looked at those 6 or 7, anyone resonate with you, for you? Or do you have other examples of what you think about when you're looking at those lenses? What does it entail? We usually provide a checklist when we go into communities and we work with communities. We'll give them a checklist of things to think about in your meetings, you know, any gathering that you will have, any planning, things to think about. So what resonates
that kind of resonated with me a little bit is remembering to name it.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times, you know, thinking about this racial equity lens is the dialogue is not about race, but we need to never forget race. And I think naming it allows that conversation to always circle back and continue. So that way we don't forget it. And it's such a simple thing, but I think that by naming it explicitly through the process, you remind participants, you remind yourself to circle back when the dialogue is not specifically about racial inequities.
Right. And sometimes you have to then, you know, in some cases you will have to have done before talking about an issue, let's say education, in a dialogue to change context, have possibly affinity group conversations about race.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to elevate the level of understanding of racism and race so that then the conversation can be already about naming it, but understanding why it's important to name it. Right?
Yeah.
We added a new group agreement to our kind of generic group agreements that we use in a whole variety of settings, situations in New Hampshire Listens a few years ago. And so one of the group agreements now is it's okay to bring up race and social class as part of the conversation. We found that we had to give people almost permission, again, in predominantly white gatherings, even those folks that were willing to go here and name race and racism would often say things, they'd be nervous, they'd censor themselves, they'd be clumsy and say things like, I don't know if I should say this, but, and so we had to have an explicit group agreement that, yeah, if it's a part of, you know, we should bring that lens to everything we're talking about, whether it's to build a new middle school in our town or change the way garbage gets picked up or you know, whatever the topic is, let's be sure that we, as I say, particularly for fragile white folks,
Yes.
create an expectation, if not permission, that we're going to go there too. you know.
Yeah,
And
very
if
good
you're
point.
facilitating or moderating, you can model that, to set that safe zone for people to feel comfortable to do it.
Right. Mhm. Let's go on to the next slides because this really, it's about the practices and the challenges. And Bruce, you mentioned already something very important that relates to this next set of slides, and is how do you practice racial equity and in the process of dialogue to change, in the actual dialogue process, the actual dialogues. And so the next slides will look at some examples or scenarios of racial equity challenges. I want you to look at this slide and see if there's any one of these scenarios resonate with you, with your experience doing dialogue to change. And this is about the organizing part of the work, of course.
I know in the work that I've done, both in Missouri and in Oklahoma, I've encountered both the first scenario and the third scenario. Generally, the dialogue groups meet in the same place every week, so we haven't seen a lot of moving around for those groups. But the first one was a major problem when we were working on dialogues related to economic opportunity and poverty in Springfield. We had all white professionals on the group that was supposed to be working on this issue and didn't have anybody with lived experience from an under-resourced or minority perspective, non-white perspective on there. And then we also ran into, because we were doing dialogues on economic opportunity and social mobility, scenario 3, we focused more on issues of equity related to class than we did on issues of equity related to race. And when a racist incident happened within one of the groups, within one of our circles, we did not have, the facilitator did not feel like they had the training to handle race issues when they came up. And so as a result of that, we started incorporating more of that racial equity lens into all, regardless of what the dialogues are about now. We're getting more of an intersection, like an intersectional approach to equity about it as they're doing that. So
yes, very, very important point. Thank you, Mike. All right, next slide. The next slide relates to facilitation. And I'm glad you mentioned, Mike, about training facilitators to be able to address when the conversation moves in terms of naming race in the conversation. Any of these scenarios resonate with you, other scenarios?
For me, definitely 4 and 5. I mean, see it all the time. I feel, yeah, in our dialogues, especially around scenario 5, so many white people, no matter what their age, is like, well, I don't know about race issues. And I think Robin DiAngelo does a good job about talking about that in her book and being like, just because you grew up in a white community doesn't mean you don't know about race issues. It means you know exactly about race issues. But that people feel like they don't know anything, so they don't talk, and they're sitting there, and they might have like good intentions to learn, but it does not create a balance, and it often leaves people of color, saying, well, I don't want to go in to these dialogues because why do I have to do all the teaching? Right. This isn't for me. This is for you to learn. It's not for me to teach. And that's actually been a little bit of the history in Syracuse, is that sort of a rejection of the dialogues because they're like, I shouldn't have to teach all the white people around here about racism.
Right. Very, very good point. And I'm glad you mentioned the DiAngelo's White Fragility book. That's a great piece. I'm sure all of us have read it. But it really gets down to why do white people tend to sort of be very quiet when it comes to talking about race. And it goes to scenario number 6, and sometimes the facilitators, sort of the moment they see white people uncomfortable, they say, oh, I don't want them to be uncomfortable. Then they shift the conversation away from race. And what that does to people of color in the dialogue group is it tells them, it's another, yet another example of their voices not being heard. Next slide. These ones have to do with action groups.
I can certainly identify, I think, with all of those. I remember specifically a time when we have a debrief meeting before we do our centering with our women who are predominantly African American, and usually our circles are usually led by African American organizations in a partnership, and so we were debriefing, and we had brought in a new doctor, OB doctor. He had sat in our circle for the very first time, and so he wasn't used to the dynamics of our circle. And sometimes, we talk about what's on the agenda, but sometimes we kind of veer to the left, and it might be some distractions in there. But we always bring ourselves back, and I don't think he was used to that. He was used to you're very serious. When you get to the meeting, you go through the agenda, and when you're done with the agenda and you handle business, then you go back to work. And so he wasn't used to how we kind of had our own debrief within our circle of partners. And so when he came in and he seen that that was happening, he jumped in and said, I think we should go right back to the agenda. I think we got off track here. So he kind of tried to redirect us based on what he was used to. In his circles. And so it took a couple times for him to get a better understanding of this is how we do our circles or how we do our debrief meetings. It wasn't necessarily your place to get us back on track, for lack of a better.
Right. And that goes to scenario 8, I think. It's about the old habits and behaviors and the white dominant default mode.
Sure.
That I'm sure we've all encountered that. And if I may indulge, number 9, it's an example of something that came up for one of our ICCL participants at the Institute for Community Change Leaders. And her name is Elizabeth Joseph, who has been doing dialogue work for the past 2-3 years. And she was doing a great conversations on race dialogue cycle a year ago in Stamford, Connecticut. And what happened was that the action teams were doing great work, but then one of the white gentlemen who participated decided to create his own action team by himself. and he went off, and then he, because, obviously other people were not participating in his action team, he started bringing people from outside who were not part of the dialogue. And a lot of them were white people who had not really being part of this learning together, and they ended up spinning off and doing some kind of other project that really was not aligned in many ways and ignored many of the racial equity issues that had been discussed in the dialogues. So I'm curious if any of you have had an experience like that one before. I'm sure you have in some way or another.
That seems like the exact opposite of what's supposed to happen as a result of these processes.
Right. Exactly.
Especially when you get to that point of doing action.
That's right. Exactly. And it's good to include different people into the process, but to keep them within the context of the dialogue to change, because it's not just action. You have to have been part of the conversation to really understand the different perspectives that were part of that process. So that's one thing that I'm sure in some way or another you've encountered. So we've run out of time, but I just want, first of all, if there's any questions at all or closing remarks from anyone.
I just want to say I appreciate the opportunity to be able to come together to have these kinds of conversations. I much prefer this kind of a Zoom meeting to the faculty meetings and other things I've been doing. Much better conversation. But I also think it's important for us to be thinking about these issues moving forward with our work, knowing that those pre-existing race and equity issues before COVID-19 are now likely to be amplified post-COVID-19. and thinking about how we can integrate this kind of language and equity lens into moving forward at a time when we actually may have some opportunities to be able to address some of those structural problems that we have because of the disruption to our life. We've had a chance to sit back. So just want to say thank you for convening us, and I appreciate that. And it's easy to think through what some next steps as we move forward with this work might look like.
That's great, Mike. Thank you so much for sharing. Any other comments? I would like to hear from everyone if possible. Just short and brief.
This is Peggy, and go ahead. Oh, thanks, Patrick. This is Peggy, and I just really appreciate, I just mostly listened in today, but I have to tell you, I learned so much and really thought-provoking. I hope I have an opportunity to participate again, and it'd be fun, I think, to really talk about what are some specific tools and actions that we could add to our toolboxes.
Yes.
So as we're doing our community work, we have some things that we can use and rely on. And I think even this network of people to get ideas from is just really, really helpful. So I appreciate this a lot.
Great. And we'll share a slide with a list of some of the materials we have on our website. And I'll be sending all of you an email with those links. So I appreciate you mentioning that. Thank you. Anyone else?
Even when I sometimes understand certain things, I enjoy the conversation to think differently, to hear other people's issues. And some of these things that were brought up are issues that I haven't faced, but it's good to know that that could happen and to be thinking through, because just because I haven't faced that in the work that I've done does not mean I'm not going to in the future. So it's always good to think about.
Thank you. That's great. Anyone else?
I think I appreciate the checklist, the racial equity ones checklist of going, this is not, I'll speak for me, this is not always natural to me because of the way that I've been brought up in the society that I live. And so it definitely sort of like yoga, right? Where it's a practice. You need to practice, you need to practice, you need to practice, and I'll make mistakes along the way. So I appreciate the checklist. And I agree, I think Peggy said it, about how you apply some of these things. One of the questions, that we are facing, not questions that we're facing, but the scenarios right now is in hiring, and hiring with a racial equity lens and what that looks like. We can talk about it all we want, but it is hard. In Syracuse, we are so segregated and there's such a gap. And it's sort of this really difficult process. And so it's such an interesting, so for me, that's the conversation I would be looking at is, okay, like now let's take a scenario and say, well, okay, what do we do with a racial equity lens? So thank you. I appreciate these conversations as well, because it's the refresher, it's the practice. It's really good.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much. Bruce.
Bruce had to leave.
Oh, he had to. Okay.
Yeah, he had to get on another Zoom.
Okay. Anyone else? All right. So at this point, Gwen and I want to thank you all for participating in this webinar, part 2. And we want to thank Sandy also. Sandy, thank you for being our hostess here.
You're welcome. Sorry for some rocky slide changes there. I was having some technical difficulties, but
that's okay,
nice to
Sandy.
meet you all.
No need to apologize. You've done a great job. Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to remind you that one of the things we want to do is always get feedback from you as to how useful these webinars are. So I'll be sending you next Monday an email with a link to a survey. And please take a few minutes to complete it. It will help us make these webinars better in the future. This webinar is recorded. So Sandy and I will work on getting it ready so that we can also send you the link to the actual recording and you can share with others in your organizations. And lastly, I will mention that there is going to be a connecting chat. We're calling them that because it's really about reaching out and connecting with our different network partners and organizations and anchors. And this one is going to be with the anchor partners, and it's scheduled for next Thursday, April 30th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I know some of you may not be able to participate. You may already be having some event at that time, but if you are able to, this is going to be on Zoom, and I'll be sending you tomorrow, sending you the link and the invite to register. When you register, you'll be receiving the login information for that webinar. Again, that's going to be next Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I'll be sending that to you tomorrow for that. And of course, the link to the webinar, to the recorded webinar and the survey on Monday. I'll send the email. Again, thank you so much, and we will send you also as well the list of resources. Sandy, we have there it is, and these are some of the resources that have to do with racial equity, and we'll be sending you that list of links by email as well. So I want to close again thanking all of you and wishing you all good health and strong spirits in the midst of this coronavirus. Please take care of yourselves, and thank you for joining us today.